So glad that you chose to be here again this evening. It is hard to believe that we are already at class number 5. At the end of this class tonight, we'll already be halfway done, which is both good and bad at the same time, at least for me. I'm happy and sad at the same time. Most of you are probably happy about that, but that's all right. No, I'm so glad you're here. And again, you come week after week, and I'm so encouraged. And I hope that this study tonight will be a blessing to you. Tonight, we're going to be talking about alleged contradictions. Class number 5, alleged contradictions. We're discussing those things in the Bible that the skeptics say contradict one another. 2 verses that seem to not be in harmony together. The reason we're studying this is because it is of very great significance and importance. I heard very recently, I was reading about a young man who went to school. He was raised by 2 faithful Christians who were members of the Lord's church, and after he grew up, about 18 or 19 years old, he went off to college, and really the parents, so far as we know, didn't really do anything wrong. They raised him very, very well, but he got into a classroom, and in that class, one of the first classes his freshman year, he was taught that the Bible was garbage, in essence, that it was a fake, that it was just made up, and he was given a list, all the students were, of alleged contradictions. And there was, I don't remember how many on that list, maybe over 100 or so alleged contradictions. I say alleged because that's what they are, is proposed to be such, not necessarily proven to be such. But he looked over that list, he couldn't answer those questions, and so he ended up leaving the church and became an atheist, no longer believing in the God of the Bible, just because someone gave him some of these contradictions that we're going to look at even tonight, and he was unable to answer them. He was unable to see how that they were not contradictions. And so what we want to do tonight is, number one, we're going to start by talking about what a contradiction is and the laws of contradictions. And then we'll get into some examples. And hopefully, some of these examples could be very difficult. Just looking at them and from the gate or on the offset, you might think to yourself, these are contradictions. But when you put these rules and apply them to it, some questions to ask yourself that I'm going to give you, then I think it becomes much simpler to answer. And ultimately, any alleged contradiction that comes up, if it's put through these series of questions and tests that we're going to talk about, you should be able to come to a conclusion that will certainly be biblical. Now, one more preface to this, and we'll jump into it, and that is that the Bible, in this case, is going to be innocent until proven guilty. That is, the Bible claims to be inspired, and it claims to be perfect and without contradiction. So until it is proven by the skeptics to be contradictory in any sense, it is innocent. Just like in a court case, it must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be guilty. And so if there's any possibility that the 2 verses being put together are not contradictory, if there's any possible solution, then that alone would suggest that the Bible is still innocent. Right? In order for it to be a contradiction, and not that we're doing magic tricks, as it were, to get around it, not that we're trying to jump through hoops or any kind of loophole or this and that, but if it legitimately contradicts based upon this definition I'm going to give you, then it is in fact a contradiction, and the Bible would not be the inspired Word of God. What is a contradiction? Aristotle put it this way. He said that the same thing should at the same time both be and not be for the same person and in the same respect is impossible. Now, if you're like me, when I first read that, I said, do what? Huh? That the same thing should at the same time both be and not be for the same person and in the same respect is impossible. Let me put it this way, because I still don't really know what that means. I think this is what he was getting at. Here's how we would define it. A true contradiction must be referring to the same person, place, or thing at the same time and in the same sense. All right? From the beginning, I want you to remember these 3 things, or ask yourself these 3 questions when you're looking at an alleged contradiction. Is it the same person, place, or thing that's being discussed in both passages? Is it happening at the same time? And is it being used in the same sense? The way the verbs are used, or the people, or the location, or whatever it might be. Okay? Now let me make this practical. Let me give you an example. Let's say that we saw this statement. John Doe is rich. But then we go to another passage of Scripture, and that passage says John Doe is poor. Looking at that, it would appear to be a contradiction. John Doe is rich and John Doe is poor. That contradicts, right? What'd you say, Stan?
The same John Doe.
Okay, excellent. Number one, are we talking about the same person, place, or thing? So in this case, is it possible there are two John Does? Absolutely. Unless the text explains clearly and you know for a fact you're talking about the same person, place, or thing, then there's a possibility it's two different ones. John Doe, if we think about this today, maybe there's a John Doe that's rich in Georgia and a John Doe that's poor in Texas. And so that would not contradict. But let's say they are the same John Doe and you're sure they're the same John Doe. Would it then contradict automatically? Exactly. What about the time frame? Part 2 of our testing, our question. Is it happening at the same time? Is it possible that John Doe could be rich at 20 and poor at 40? Sure. So the same guy could both be rich and poor as long as it's not at the same time. Okay? So even if it is the same John Doe, it still may not be a contradiction. What about this one? What if it's the same person and it is at the same time? Could it still possibly be true? Well, you got to ask number 3, is it in the same sense? Here's what I mean by that. Is it possible that John Doe could be rich in a sense and poor in another sense at the same time?
Yes, sir.
Absolutely. What might we say? How could John Doe be rich and poor at the same time?
Rich in worldly possessions, poor in spirit.
There you go. Poor spiritually speaking and rich physically speaking. Do we see that biblically at any point? You ever read about someone being rich physically and poor spiritually? And so again, you've got, if John Doe is said to be the same John Doe that lives at address such and such in Georgia, or is this particular sibling or whatever, if it's the same John Doe at the same time and in the same way being said that he's rich and poor, that is a contradiction. All right? That's the rules. Those are the 3 things I want you to ask. Let me add something else to that too, though. Number 4, you might say, oh, by the way, let me give you a scenario biblically before we move on. I forgot about this. Let's look at a couple of Bible examples of each of the 3 scenarios, just so you can see. And these are alleged contradictions that are brought up. Let's look at a person, place, or thing example. PPT there, person, place, or thing. Here's an example of a person. Acts 12 and verse 2. I want to look at each of the 3 I just gave you, and then I want to add 2 more. And then we'll move on to some examples. Acts 12 and verse 2. Someone who might raise their hand that would be willing to read Acts 12 and verse 2 for us. And then I'll need another one for Acts 15:13. Who's got Acts 12:2? That will read that out loud for us. Larry, okay.
And he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword.
Excellent. Herod killed James. James died, okay? He is no longer living. Acts chapter 15 and verse 13. Someone else that's willing to read that for us.
And after they had held their peace, James answered, saying, Men and brethren, hearken unto me.
All right, now, how could James have been killed in Acts chapter 12 by Herod, and then 3 chapters later in Jerusalem be a figure that's standing up in the Jerusalem meeting and speaking out on behalf of the gospel? Is that a contradiction? This isn't a legend one, by the way. This is not a difficult one. We're going to look at some that are more difficult. This is not a difficult one, though. Because what do you know? And if you're a member here and you've been in the Bible class, you know this already because Larry covered it. What do you know about these 2 Jameses? Sorry? You're probably saying it. They're different Jameses, not the same James. In Acts 12, who is this James that died? In fact, he says in verse 2, James, the brother of who? John, one of the sons of Zebedee. This is James, the son of Zebedee. Who is the James in Acts chapter 15 that's still living? And that also wrote the book of James, by the way. Half-brother of Jesus. That's right. 2 different Jameses. So that's not a contradiction because it's not the same person, place, or thing. And so by asking our very first question, we already solved that one. All right? You see where we're going with this? Let's look at an example of a time issue. All right, somebody, Genesis 1 and verse 31. Genesis 1 and verse 31. And then somebody else go ahead and have already turned to Genesis 6 for us. Verses 5 and 6. When you get there, Genesis 1:31, anyone that's willing.
Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good.
Excellent. Oh, I'm sorry. Was there more? I apologize.
Evening and morning
Yes.
were the 6th day.
Excellent. Thank you. So when he finished the completion of creating the world, he saw that it was very what? It was very good. All right, Genesis 6, 5, and 6. Someone else.
The Lord saw that the wickedness of and that every intent of the thought of his heart was only evil constantly. And the Lord was sorry that he made man on earth, and he was displeased with his heart. So the Lord said,
Excellent. Excellent job. So, Genesis 1:31, he created it, everything, it was very good. But when you get to Genesis 6, it was not good. It was, or man's evil intentions were always, it was all evil. How is it possible that God, and by the way, Dan Barker brought this up in his debate with Kyle Butt. This was an alleged contradiction he brought up. How is it possible that God created everything and it was good, and then in chapter 6 all of a sudden it wasn't good? That's a contradiction, isn't it? Yeah, he created. Now, are we talking about the same creation? Are we talking about man? Does the person, place, or thing solve the problem in this case? Is it the same God and the same creation?
Time and the same people, but in the second reading, man has already started to sin.
Right, exactly.
I'm with you.
It is the same person, place, or thing in this case. It's God and it's His creation. But then when you get to number 2, is it the same time period? And the answer is no. He made them very good, yes. But with freedom of choice, man chose wrong and sin entered the world. And so at that point, later in time, they weren't. Everything wasn't very good. So it's not a contradiction because it did not happen at the same time. They weren't very good and very bad in the same moment. Make sense? All right, so let's look at one about the idea of a sense. Genesis 2:17 and Genesis 5:5. Genesis 2:17, Genesis 5:5. Someone read 2:17 for us, please.
But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die.
Excellent. When you eat of that tree, in the day that you eat, you will die. Genesis 5 verse 5.
And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died.
Excellent. Here's another alleged contradiction. It's in the list. How in the world did Adam live to be 930 when he ate of the tree and was told that in that day you will surely die? Are we talking about the same Adam? Question 1. Is it the same person? Yes. Are we talking about the correct time period? Is there a time issue as far as to when he was going to die? Yeah, no problems there. However, is there a sense issue here? Could it be that there's a different sense in which that word die is used? Absolutely. Right? Did he die in the day he ate the fruit, the way it said?
No, but he was headed that way. He was headed for death.
Okay, you could argue that.
Before that, he was not.
Right, and that's true. I think with that particular one, because it says in the day you eat thereof, you will die, not begin death. Probably a better, not that that's not a possibility. It could be that he began to have that process of death at that point. I've heard that argument, and not that that isn't a possibility. But what would make even maybe more sense in this case? How did he die that day? Spiritual death, separation from God. See, he did die that day in one sense, and physically he did begin that death. That is a good point as well. Regardless,
He was going to live forever. God created man to be flawless and would have lived on this earth forever.
if he had eaten of what?
Sin had not come into it.
Right, if sin had not come into it, and he also had to partake of what tree in order to live forever? The tree of life. And he still could have if he had eaten of it. Remember, that's why they put them out of the garden. But yeah, he did.
God knew he was going to do that.
Yeah, he did.
When he made it.
Yeah, absolutely. Man chose wrong. So there you've got an example of a different sense in which it's used. So you ask yourself those three questions. Now, it is possible, as we'll see in a moment, that all three of those things would align, but there's also two more things I want you to consider. And I'm giving you these five because I think they're pretty much all-encompassing of the scenarios I've seen. Number 4 here, if those three things don't take care of it, in most cases they will, then ask yourself this question: is there supplemental information? In other words, is this a situation where all of those things are legitimate, but there's not a contradiction in that really it's just giving extra information. It doesn't contradict what was going on. For example, is it possible that the Florida Gators played a good offensive football game? Of course. Okay, no, I would agree with that. But all jokes aside, I would agree. All jokes aside, I should have used a different team, shouldn't I? Let's say the Florida Gators and Larry says they played a good offensive ball game. And then let's say Bill Horn said they played a good defensive ball game. Could both of those things be true? It's the same team. It happened at the same time, during the same game, and there's no different senses in the way they're talking about playing. So all of those are true, but why is it not contradictory? Because that information, can they both have played good offense and defense? If both of those things can be true, then it's just supplemental information. In other words, they're just adding on more to it. It is possible that a football team could have a good offense in a game and a good defense in a game. Both of those things are true. It's just additional information. Biblically, for example, Mark 6 and verse 44. Jesus fed 5,000 men. 5,000 men. Matthew 14 and verse 21, Jesus fed 5,000 men and women and children. Same group of individuals, same time period, feed is in the same sense, but it's still not a contradiction. Why?
A little more information.
It's just a little more information. He just added on that there were also women and children. It would be a contradiction if Mark had said men, what? Only.
Yeah, they didn't feed the kids and the women.
Exactly. If he said the women and kids were not fed, and then Matthew said they were, that's a contradiction. Or men only. And you see that word only, that would make a difference. But that wasn't the case. Another biblical example, the women at the tomb. Have you ever noticed if you look at Matthew, Mark, and John, those three books name the women. I don't think Luke does, but those three at least name the women that went to the tomb. John, if I'm recalling this correctly, says Mary Magdalene went. Matthew says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. And Mark says Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, Joanna, and Salome. How is that possible? They all four were there. If all four were there, would it still be true to say that Mary Magdalene was there? Right? Again, John didn't say Mary Magdalene alone was there. And even if he did, you then have to ask the question, did she arrive before everybody else got there? You've got a lot of things to address in order for it to be a true contradiction. And that's so very critical. The women at the tomb are not a contradiction because it's supplemental information. Some writers chose to give a little extra information than others. All right, everybody with me so far? All right, one more I want to give you, and then we're going to look at some more difficult examples that hopefully these things will help us take care of. I said one more. It's actually going to be two more. I forgot about this one. Look and see who is talking. This is just kind of a good side note, really. Not necessarily a rule, although it can come in handy. But pay attention to who's actually talking. Because sometimes an alleged contradiction could just be somebody telling the truth and somebody else is telling a what? A lie. Ask yourself if they're both true. One of the greatest examples is God says to Adam and Eve, you eat of that tree and you're going to what? You're going to die. But what did Satan say to him in Genesis 3:4? You will not. You're not going to die. Is that a contradiction? No, because Satan said that. Satan was telling a big old what? John 8:44. He was lying. And so we understand that. Make sure you know who's talking to it. I'll give you a huge one. Who killed Saul? This is a major one and much more difficult if you don't apply this particular rule. In fact, we were just talking about this the other day when we were reading together. In 1 Samuel 31, the Bible says that the Philistines, and there's a couple different wordings, the Philistines killed Saul, which is true in the sense that arrow, remember, from the Philistines went through Saul, and so the Philistines were credited with that death. But ultimately, who really killed Saul, biblically speaking? Saul killed Saul, didn't he? Remember, he fell on his own sword. Would his armor bearer kill him when he asked him to do so? And what did the armor bearer do, by the way, after Saul killed himself? He killed himself too. But when you get to 2 Samuel chapter 1 and you get down to verse 10, and this Amalekite comes to David and tells David, listen, I just happened to be going by and I know that Saul died. And the reason I know that, you remember what he said? I killed him. I killed him. And that poor fella, David took his life for that. And the sad thing is, that's not a contradiction because this Amalekite didn't kill him. This Amalekite wasn't an inspired statement, right? The Amalekite's claiming to have done so, and he brought what was it, a bracelet or something, and a ring or something like that, a crown, and he wanted some credit, but boy, that backfired, didn't it? He told a lie. He absolutely lied. So that's not a contradiction. God didn't say in one passage, Saul killed himself, and in another, God said this. This is a random sinner that comes up and makes a statement. That doesn't make it true. I'll give you another quick example. I want to say it's John 8 and verse 31 or so, maybe it's John 9:31. I believe it's John 9:31. When we talk about God hearing sinners' prayers, and there's some passages that talk about it, but a lot of times we want to go to around John 9:31 when you have a situation when, I believe it's a Pharisee that makes the statement, we know that God heareth not what? Sinners. You can't take John 9:31, a statement from a Pharisee, and bind that on people and say this is what the Bible teaches. That's just something a Pharisee said. In a narrative form, that's the statement he made. That doesn't mean that it's law and that it's accurate and that's the truth. So we've got to always pay attention to who is talking. Very, very critical. All right, one more. Be fair. Last one, very simple one. Be fair to the Bible. Here's what I mean by that. Your fellow worker comes to work with you one day, and he makes this statement. I woke up this morning at sunrise. Now question, does the sun rise? Technically? No. So you say to him, you ignorant man, or whatever you want to call him, you're just ignorant. The sun doesn't rise, the earth's spinning on its axis. Why don't you correct him? Why don't you say that to him? You know what he meant. You just understand. We know that the sun doesn't rise, but we use that language. We say the sun rose in the morning because we perceive it to be that way. So give the Bible the same credit. The Bible talks about the sun rising, and that's been talked about as an alleged contradiction. 1 Corinthians is an example, 15:6, when Paul says that there were those who had fallen asleep. Right? Some say, Paul didn't know what he was talking about. They weren't asleep, they were what? They were dead. But why would Paul say fallen asleep? Have you ever heard somebody talk about the deceased with loved ones around? Do they usually say something like, yeah, so-and-so kicked the bucket, or so-and-so is dead now, he's gone. Right? They don't word it that way. How do they usually say it? He's passed away, or he's went on to be with the Lord, or he started that new life. And why do we say it that way? It's kinder. There's a comfort in that, and it's absolutely true. And so we're very compassionate towards those. And so Paul puts it that way. They've fallen asleep. Okay, so let's be fair to him. He knew what he was talking about, but he said it in a way that was very kind. That's not a contradiction to other verses that say those people were in fact dead. Even Jesus did that, didn't he, with Lazarus? Remember, he told the disciples, he's fallen asleep, and they said, oh, well, good, right? And he said, no, guys, he's dead. That was just the way I put it, in essence. Okay, any questions, comments, thoughts so far? All right, let's apply these rules, about 6 or so things that we've looked at, and let's put them to practice in some of the most difficult alleged contradictions that many in the church have left over, that many Christians have decided they're not going to have anything to do with the Bible, including this young man we mentioned earlier. Some of these, if not all of them, were on that list. Let's start in Genesis. Lot. How many daughters did Lot have? Some of these maybe you've noticed before, and maybe some of them you have not. But let's go to Genesis 19. We're going to all turn together now, myself included, and slow down a bit and look at some of these very, very alleged powerful contradictions. John 19, verse number 8. I'll give you a moment to turn there. John 19 and verse number 8. What am I saying? Oh, Genesis. Am I saying John? Genesis, I'm sorry. Genesis 19. See if y'all are awake. No, that's not true. Genesis chapter 19. Thank you.
First part of this there, the M2.
That's right. Genesis 19:8. Let's read it since you're there. Behold now, I have how many daughters? 2 daughters, which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes. I don't even understand that statement, but that's a whole other topic. Only unto these men, he says, do nothing. You remember the scenario? The guy's knocking on the door. They are wanting to physically participate in sin with other men. And so he says, therefore came they under the shadow of my roof. And so verse 8, I have 2 daughters. Verse number 15, jump down. And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, Arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters. And the Lord, and the Lord being merciful unto him, and they brought him forth and sent him out. No, I jumped to 16. Arise and take thy wife and thy 2 daughters, which are here. There we go. Lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. Okay. Verse 8, verse 15, he appears to have how many daughters? 2 daughters. Also, specifically in verse 8, it mentions that these 2 daughters have never what? Known a man. Okay, that's significant. Here's the alleged contradiction. Verse 14. Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and said, Up, get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy his city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. Why is this an apparent contradiction?
So he had more than 2 daughters.
Or that, yeah.
You take it totally out of context.
Yeah, you could say it's a contradiction because he's got extra daughters. And why would you have to assume that he has more than the 2 daughters?
2 of them married.
Because they're married. And yet the 2 he's got in his home with him are what? They've never known a man. They're virgins. And so how can this be? How can you have the sons-in-law, plural, when you've got 2 daughters who are virgins? All right? This appears to be a contradiction. Now, let's go through our list. Number 1, are we talking about the same daughters, the same people? Possibly not. Now remember, we may not, and this is why I said at the beginning, if there's any possibility, it's not a contradiction. Because we're not always going to know the answer. God doesn't always reveal everything to us. Some things are just secret, some things were not important. But because of these skeptics, we have to at least find a possibility that's legitimate. And so there is already a possible legitimate explanation here, and that is that it is not the same 2 daughters. Did you ever see the word only when mentioning 2 daughters?
No.
You didn't. In fact, look at verse 8 again. This is one possible explanation. Notice, I have 2 daughters which have not known man. In other words, I have 2 daughters that are virgins. What could that mean? Is it possible that he has other daughters that are not? Absolutely. I wouldn't contradict that at all. So I've got 2 daughters, and by the way, in verse 15, don't miss this. Arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters. What are the next 3 words? Which are here. That pretty much takes care of it. Your 2 daughters, why would he say that? Your 2 daughters which are here. What does that imply? What's the inference? Yeah, not the ones that aren't there. In other words, you've got some daughters that aren't here. So one possible explanation, and a very good one, is that he's got more than 2 daughters, and the other daughters are the ones married to the sons-in-law. All right? Now, that pretty much takes care of it, but there is another possible explanation, and just for sake of learning these steps, we go on to step 2, and are we talking about is there any time issue? And there's not. But think about this. Is it possible that there is a different sense in which that idea of sons-in-law or married is used? Is it possible that there can be a description in the Bible of someone who is married that has not yet come together physically? Is that a possibility? Because when we think of marriage, we think about them having consummated that marriage. For example, Matthew 1:19, Joseph, remember he's talked to by the angel, and Mary, and she's got the Holy Ghost has given her this baby. And is Mary a virgin or not?
Yeah.
Of course she's a virgin. That's very critical to the whole story, right? The virgin birth. And yet Matthew 1 and verse 19 calls Joseph her what? Her husband. Why would it call him her husband?
So they were married, or they were betrothed.
They were engaged, exactly. They were married in that sense. Is it true that they were married? Yes. They weren't married in the sense that they consummated the marriage, but the Bible still uses that term. They were betrothed, it said just back in verse 18, I believe it is, and then immediately calls him her husband. And so you can see that sense in which they could be sons-in-law. And by the way, again, those 2 women were still with their father. In the betrothal period, would they live together in the same house? The spouses and No. Where would the daughters be? In their parents' home still. So that certainly is another legitimate possibility. Therefore, is this a factual contradiction? Absolutely not. There's at least two very good possibilities that would answer this question. Make sense?
Take it totally out of context
Absolutely.
for it to be a seeming contradiction.
You would. Absolutely.
You can't do that with any part of the Scripture and still get the real meaning.
That's it. You're absolutely right. And if we have time in the discussion question, we're going to talk about that thought actually. But we'll come back to it. Any other thoughts on this particular one? Did everybody understand? Any confusion there? Very good. All right, let's go to another one. How many apostles saw Jesus after his resurrection? This is a pretty common one. How many of you have heard of this one? Seen of the 12, 1 Corinthians 15:5. Okay, well good. That's great. Matthew 27. Let's look at these. That's right. I could put the verses up there and type them out for you, but that would just be too easy. Then you wouldn't even have to use your Bible. I don't want to do that. You gotta see it for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Matthew 27:5. Let me just mention these and turn to them if you like. And for time's sake, I'm going to mention what the three say. Matthew 27:5. When Judas, after he gave that money back, the 30 pieces of silver, he went and what? He hung himself. Judas, before Jesus was resurrected, before he even died, before he was resurrected and was seen of the 12, Judas was already what? He was dead. That's the key. Judas had already passed. Mark 16 and verse 14, was Thomas with the 12 when Jesus met with the apostles? He wasn't. In fact, Mark 16:14 says he was not with them. And remember that conversation that took place? Right? I'll believe if you allow me to what? Touch you. You remember we call him Doubting Thomas. We pick on him a little bit. Right? So really, ultimately, there were only 10 apostles that saw him. John 20 and verse 24. Let's turn to that one, or I need to real quick because it just left me. John 20. Oh, that may be Thomas. John 20:24 is Thomas. What is Mark 16? Oh, it says 11 there. That's right. Okay, Mark 16:14 says 11 saw him. And there you go. You could just look at that one verse. 11 saw him, and now he included Thomas there. John 20 verse 24 mentions Thomas was not there when the original set saw him. Here's the contradiction, though, allegedly. 1 Corinthians 15:5. Here's what we do want to read. I'll read to you since I'm already there. He talks about him being buried, raised again on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. This is a majorly used contradiction. And from the first side of this, it seems to be rather difficult. Because it said he was seen of the 12, but how many saw him? Even after Thomas saw him, how many was that? 11, which would go along with Mark 16:14. Judas did not see him. Was Matthias selected yet? No. You know, some might say he included Matthias here, but really Matthias didn't see him in that sense after his resurrection, in that set of 12 that were there. And so 1 Corinthians 15:5, especially in the chronological order that he's mentioning, time-wise, it's referencing that situation when he saw the group of 10 apostles. So how in the world can this not be a contradiction when he says the 12? All right, are we talking about, first of all, the same people, place, or thing? Is this the same apostles, or is this a different set somehow? Right? Are we talking about the same people? If you're looking at me crazy, the answer is no. It's not a different set, right? Right? And you don't have two different sets of apostles, of course. So you've got the same set. There's no issue there, okay? Or is there an issue with time? Is this a different time period that 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about? It's not. It's absolutely not. All right, what about a sense? Is there a sense in which he could have used that word 12 differently than meaning all 12 of them literally? Let me put it to you this way. Here's just a way to apply this today. Many of you are college football fans. You know the conference known as the Big Ten. All right? Why is it called the Big Ten? Started out with 10. How many teams does it have now? A bunch, 14. Last I checked, the Big Ten has 14 teams, but what's the title of that group still called? The Big Ten. The Big 12, why is it called the Big 12, college football? Started out with 12. How many does it have now? 10. Right? Why is it called the Big 12 still? Because in other words, what can happen is a group, an original group, can all of a sudden kind of adopt that name and just be called the 12 or the 10 or the Big 10 or Big 12 in that sense. So question, is it possible that the apostles became known as the 12. Absolutely. Absolutely. You could see them in the first century doing the same thing. You could call them the apostles, or you might just call them the 12. There weren't literally 12 at that point, but they could be called the 12. In fact, why was Matthias added on? To make them 12 again. That's a very symbolic number. Sometime I'd love to, maybe we'll get into a study of numbers in the Bible, and 12 is a very important number, that idea of completion there. And so you've got that possibility there, explanation of sense, a different sense of the word 12. Furthermore, again, this would also kind of couple in the idea of being fair to the Bible. Again, we need to be fair. Is it possible he called them the 12? Right? It's not literally 12 apostles, but he could have called them that, of course, just like we do even today. All right? Any other thoughts, any other possible explanations there? I gave you the one I'm familiar with, but maybe there's something else, another explanation. I think that does pretty much cover that one, right? Let's keep going. Let me check my time real quick. All right, let's keep going. That worked out well. We got a few more I'd like to get to if we can. 6 or 8 days. This one was harder for me. When I first looked at this, and again, I'm looking at the alleged contradictions, and this one was a little tough for me, and it took me some time to kind of going through the ones I gave you to really see how this one worked. Let me show you why. Mark 9 and verse 2. And it's really not as hard as I made it out to be, but sometimes things are just, some people have a harder time with some things than others, and this may be very simple for you, and it probably will be, but I had a harder time figuring this one out. Mark 9 and verse 2. Mark 9 and verse number 2. Jesus had just got done, talking about our time period here, he had just got done preaching this lesson, or statement, prophesying I should say, in which he said, there will be some of you that will not taste of death until the kingdom comes with power. Some of you are going to be alive when the church comes. All right, that's a prophetic statement. And as soon as that statement is over in verse 1, in verse 2 of Mark 9, he says, after 6 days, Jesus taketh with him Peter, James, and John, and leadeth them up into a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. After the prophecy, the transfiguration occurred, according to Mark 9:2, how many days after that prophecy that was taught? After 6 days. All right, that's our time period. That's the individual. We're talking about Jesus. There's our 6 days. It happened at the transfiguration. Okay, we got all that together. Now let's look at what Luke says in chapter 9. It is going to say something different. Luke 9 and verse 28. Luke 9 and verse 28. By the way, verse 27, he finishes the prophecy. You will not taste of death until the kingdom comes. Exact same statement. And in verse 28 it says, it came to pass about how many days after these sayings? 8. Not 7, not 5, but 8. 2 days difference. He took Peter and John and James and went up into a mountain to pray. Okay, well, does it mention transfiguration? 29, as he prayed, the fashion of his countenance was altered. All right, do we have the same Jesus, or is there a different Jesus? Of course it's the same Jesus. Do we have the same time period? Is this the same event taking place? Yeah. Absolutely. After the preaching, the transfiguration. There's no way around that. Is there a different sense in which he means days? Could there be a figurative day here somehow? Not really. Not as we would think. Could there be supplemental? Is this extra information? Not really. So the last option here is the fairness. Is there a way that these two could have both been true in their statement and that be fair?
The word about.
Okay, very good. You notice that Luke did not ever intend for the readers to think of it as 8 24-hour days. Therein lies the answer to this one. And that's what it took me so long to notice that. Therein lies the answer, because 6 full days did in fact pass. How is it that one could say 6 days and literally 6 24-hour days passed, and another could say 8, even though it wasn't 8 literal 24-hour days? How's that possible?
The end of one, beginning of another.
Outstanding. You're right on. Absolutely. Let's say you were at a murder scene, and you witnessed a murder on Monday, and 7 days later, and I'm going to say 7 days, you can debate, we're getting into that, but the next Monday is the point. 1 week later, you describe the murder to someone, and you say, he has been dead for 6 days. Is that true? Absolutely. He's been dead for 6 full days. What are the full days that he was dead? If he died on Monday, and he says he was dead 6 full days, what would those days be?
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Sunday. And not Monday. Why not the day he said it?
Because it's not a full.
It's not a full day. The day's not over. And so 6 days. Could I be standing there and then say, he's been dead for about 8 days?
Sure.
Why would that also be true? That's it. You count the terminal days. You count the days on the end, the bookends. You count the day he died, and you count the day that you're making the statement. Hence the word about. So when you see Luke here write this and say about, you've got the exact same scenario. He counted, whereas, what was the other one? Mark did not count the day the prophetic statement was made or the day of the transfiguration. He said 6 days, literal full days passed before that happened. Absolutely true. Luke included the terminal days. He included the prophetic day, the day before, and he included the day after or the day of the transfiguration. And so therefore, about 8 days had passed since that statement was made. Make sense? See, that really wasn't that hard, but just looking at it, it took me a while to get the crux of that one. So again, we got to be fair in that case. Most of that this was a difficult one because most of it lines up, but we're a little unfair if we don't think that they could both make that statement be true when you look at it that way. Go ahead.
Inclusive and exclusive.
Inclusive and exclusive. Excellent. That's a good way to put it. Inclusive and exclusive. And that covers it. That's exactly what happened here. Any other thoughts or questions about this one?
That same principle applies over in the Old Testament, where it talks about the sun standing still
Yes.
for 24 hours.
Absolutely.
And scientists say, no, it's not 24 hours, but the Scripture says about 24 hours.
That's exactly right. That's a very good point. That's another one. And speaking of that, Jesus and the resurrection, how many days was he in the tomb? 3 days and 3 nights. But was he in the tomb a full 54? Is that right? What's 3 times 24? Somebody help me out. 72. Boy, I was way off. 72. I have that day, didn't I? 72 hours? Was he in the tomb a full 72 hours? No. That's that same principle. Whereas one says he was in there 3 days and another says 3 days and 3 nights, you've got that same principle of what you're including, inclusive and exclusive. That's a great way to put it. Excellent point. And so again, a lot of these, I try to give different and unique ones. Some with numbers, some with people, some with supplemental information. I think we're about to see another one of those. And so putting all that together, hopefully you can apply these same principles to all these others that are basically the same concepts, the same scenarios in a different passage.
Dalton,
Yes, sir.
in every instance that you're talking about, someone saying that there are contradictions,
Mm-hmm.
they just simply don't keep things in context, and
Yep.
they want to find a problem.
Yep. That's it.
And, and there are very few true Christians that will question doubt.
Yeah. You're getting ahead of me. Again, that's what we're going to get to that, I hope, hopefully. Time permitting.
I do that.
I know. I bless your heart, you hear that from both of us, don't you? Because, well, you just know. You're exactly right. You're accurate, and it happened to be something that I put in here because you're exactly right. And I want to talk about that more in a minute. Hold that thought because you're exactly right. One or two more, and then hopefully we'll get to that. What about this one? This is another common one. You've seen the issue about how Judas died? In one case, he hanged himself, and the other, his bowels gushed out. You know? Have you heard this one? That's a gross one, but this is a real strong one.
It happens in hanging.
Matthew 27:5. He what? How did he die? We already read this one. He hung himself. After giving him the 30 pieces of silver, he hung himself. Have you ever noticed when they're picking Matthias to take his place, how they say he died? Acts 1 and verse 18. Let's go over there. That one probably is not the more common of the two. Acts 1 and verse 18. How did Judas die? Or how does it describe his death? That's it. Now this man purchased the field with the reward of iniquity, and falling headlong, face first as it were, he burst asunder in the midst, and all his bowels gushed out. Well, that's a nice picture, isn't it? How can that be true? How can Judas have hung himself and that be the way he died? And then over here it say he fell face first. That's not being hung. He fell face first and...
Your head fall off.
Why are y'all so good at this? Y'all didn't need this class. Y'all already know all the answers. Right? Is it the same Judas going through the scenario? Yes. Is there a situation where it could be a different time period here?
Yeah, several hours.
That's it. This is a time issue. In that, it is possible, and again, this is also supplemental information. He did die being hanged, but what could have happened? He hung himself. He was there, and it's true, he choked, asphyxiation, however you want to put it. But in time, even historically, they say that he was over a kind of a dip, almost a cliff. You see it pictured that way when you look at the images. Why would you want to do that? But that's it. And so they say that he then later, that rope was broke. Either they cut him down, or it rotted and he fell down, or whatever the case. And he fell down head first, his body tilted over, and they say his rocks hit him here. And what happens to that body after some time has passed? Absolutely. So it certainly makes sense that bursting could have happened. Ooh. So I can think of one member that I'm glad is not here. She wouldn't be able to handle this. But so does that make sense? You with me? So it doesn't contradict, because it's not saying that these two things happen at the exact same time. This is supplemental information that later in time occurred. Pretty straightforward. But this is a big one. I mean, there are lots of folks, lots of renowned atheists who claiming that this is a contradiction and that Christianity is bogus because of this one contradiction and the others we're looking at. Last one, and then we'll discuss for a moment before we conclude. Did Paul hear a voice? One more. Let's go to Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9. Most of these I had not come across without study. I've seen most of these by now in studies in the past. But this particular one happened to me. I was in college, and I was studying about calling on the name of the Lord and studying how Paul did that. And I was reading through the scenarios from Acts 9, 16, and about 22. And I noticed this. And I went to my college minister, Barry Kennedy at the time, and I asked him, how is this not a contradiction? And he gave me the response, and he's absolutely right. And I believe it's the conclusion we'll come to right here. Acts chapter 9, verse 7. All right, there he is in Acts chapter 9, a man by the name of Saul, Saul of Tarsus. Jesus comes to him in a bright light, speaks to him. And in verse 7, after this conversation takes place, the men which journeyed with Saul stood speechless. What are the next three words? Hearing a voice, but seeing no man. Okay? According to Acts 9:7, the men that were with him, and Paul, I guess as well, heard a voice. But look at Acts chapter 22.
Acts chapter 22.
Acts chapter 22. We'll jump over there. Acts chapter 22. By the way, anybody ever heard of this one before or noticed this one? All right. Had anybody ever heard of any of these alleged contradictions? Okay, some of you. Okay, all right. Very good. That's okay. I love that. Anything that can be some new information is fantastic. I just being curious. Acts 22 and verse 9. All right. Now in Acts 22, are we talking about the same Saul of Tarsus? Right. Again, he's called Saul of Tarsus. I mean, it's not two different Sauls here. We know it's the same guy. Is it the same scenario or event? Is Jesus coming in a light? Yeah. In fact, he's recapping what took place. And so that being said, look at verse number 9. The men that were with him saw indeed the light, and they were afraid, but they heard not the voice of him that spake to me. How's that not a contradiction? Acts 9, they heard the voice. Acts 22, they didn't hear the voice. Same person, same people, same scenario and time, location. Is there a sense in which the word here could be used differently?
They heard and didn't understand.
Okay, good. They heard but didn't understand. It's that simple. Have you ever said to someone, let's say you're talking to your spouse or to a family member or a friend, and you're having a conversation and they say something to you, and you heard that they were speaking, but you didn't hear what they said? How do you usually say it? You say, I'm so sorry I didn't... You might say understand, which would be true, but you probably would say, I always say, I'm sorry I didn't hear you. Right? I heard that you were speaking, but I did not understand what you said. Amber gets that a lot from me. I didn't hear you, sweetie. What'd you say? Right? But why would I say I didn't hear you if I didn't hear her voice? She knows what that means. That's right. Don't feed her now. That's what she always said. You're making it true. You're not paying attention, Dalton. It's true. Just because I'm doing something else. Not on purpose, of course. But that's the idea. Different senses here. There's no supplemental information. It's not like that. And I guess you could apply the fairness to it. Again, let's be fair. We do the same thing. We say, I didn't hear you, even though we heard. So in Acts 22, what we're learning here is they did hear him, but they did not know what he said. They did not understand the words. But who did understand the words? Paul. I should have worded that, did men hear a voice, not did Paul. Did men hear a voice? The men around Paul hear a voice. That's really the alleged contradiction. All right, any other thoughts or comments on that particular one?
Same thing could be said.
Yes, sir.
A foreign language. Somebody speaking in a foreign language. I heard him, but I didn't understand.
That's it, exactly. That's a good point. I heard him speaking, but I didn't know what he said.
And we had that in Acts also. We had examples of that, speaking and not understanding.
And not understanding, that's true. Yep.
Language.
That's exactly right, because of the language barrier. You're exactly right. You see examples of that. All right, our time is almost up. I know we can't discuss all these four, but since Stan mentioned it, I believe it's question 2. Yes. Let's end with this final thought, and hopefully you'll remember these rules and what they were. What are the questions you're going to ask yourself before we read that? Don't read it yet. What are the questions we're going to ask ourselves when the skeptics give us an alleged contradiction? Is it the same person, place, or thing? Is it the same time period? Is it taking place at the same exact time? Same sense. Is it being used in the same respect as Aristotle put it, or the same sense? All right. Is it supplemental information? Who's speaking? Very good. I wonder if you'd remember that one. Look who's talking. Right. Most of the time, it won't be that particular one, but there are a few instances like Satan there in the garden. And then number 6, last but not least, are we being unfair? Is it something that would have been understood in the way that was worded? Very, very good. All right. One discussion thought, and the lesson will be yours. Is it possible that some who believe in these contradictions might be wanting them to be legitimate? Why or why not? This is where Stan was leading into with this. Are there some people who want this to take place? Why do you think that is? Why would some want there to be? Why would they be looking for these contradictions? Because Stan's exactly right. They do want it. Why do you think some might be a little biased and hoping that they can find it? Exactly. One, they're just trying to be right. We want to prove to you why we don't believe it.
Everybody wants to be right.
Okay, good. Yeah, everybody wants to be right. I do. I'll be honest. I want to be right. I don't like being wrong. I'm wrong a lot, though, aren't I? But I don't like it. Right? I don't like it at all, but I am.
Study to show yourself approved and not be wrong.
That's right. You study to show yourself approved so you're not wrong. That's right. What might be another reason, very quickly, what might be another reason they want that to be the case? Yes, ma'am. Exactly. I think that's a big part of this too, because they just want to continue doing what they're doing. Because if it doesn't contradict itself, then that means what? If it does contradict itself, the Bible's no good. But if it doesn't, what does that mean for that person? That's an atheist. He's wrong. Not only is he wrong, it applies to him, and he's got to straighten up. He or she does. They don't want it to be the case because they got to make a lot of changes. Right? Now, not that that's always the case. I think in the case of the young man, the young boy that was pulled away, I don't think he wanted it to be that way. I think he was misled. But I think there are instances where there are individuals who are using that as a way to avoid it. They don't have to change their life, and they get to get out of it. We don't always know their intentions, but that certainly is a possibility. I want to discuss some of these others, especially the first one there, but our time is up. Any other very important comments, questions, or concerns before we dismiss? Certainly don't want to leave anything out or anyone out.
You got 5 more minutes before you final.
I know it. I just hate to leave you. It's an hour. It's a long time to make you sit in that pew, and I know how it is. And I just... I appreciate that. I do. How about you leave thinking? I'll compromise with you. Leave thinking about this one. How does faith come into the picture when these skeptics propose these alleged contradictions? Don't answer now, but just think to yourself, even if you couldn't answer it, is there some faith involved in there? Just something to think about. You know the answer, I think. But thank you so much for being here tonight. I absolutely love these classes, and I hope that they're of benefit to you. And I am so encouraged by you coming and being here each week. Next week, Lord willing, I believe our topic is Jesus. And you would think I would have looked at that ahead of time. I didn't even think about it. But I believe next week is Jesus proving His being here on earth and that empty tomb that He left. We have some evidence for that, and that's what we're going to discuss next week, Lord willing. Thank you so much for your good time and attention, and God bless you.